My name is Eleanor, and if people see me today, they often imagine that I was born confident, that I always carried this quiet determination. But the truth is my strength was forged in a childhood where I was constantly reminded that I came second. I grew up in a modest two-story house in Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors trimmed their lawns and waved at each other as if everything in their lives was perfectly fine. My father was a civil engineer, always neat with his briefcase and navy suit, and my mother worked as a teacher's aide, gentle with strangers but sharp with me. When I was little, before my brother Nathan arrived, I felt special. They took pictures of me at preschool, clapped when I recited a poem, taped my drawings to the refrigerator as though they meant the world. But when Nathan was born, when I was 5 years old, something shifted permanently. My parents called him their little prince, and with every passing year I understood that the crown he wore in their hearts was carved out of pieces they had taken from me. I remember my 7th birthday. I woke early with excitement, hoping for a gift that showed they knew me, that they valued my effort in school, that they cared. I unwrapped the package to find a stack of second-hand encyclopedias. My mother smiled and said, "These will make you smarter, sweetheart. You're such a bright girl." I thanked her quietly because I had been raised to be grateful no matter what. 1 week later, Nathan had his 3rd birthday, and he unwrapped a shining red miniature electric car with flashing lights. A toy so grand the neighbors came out to watch him drive down the driveway, while my father filmed every moment on the camcorder. They clapped, he laughed, and I stood on the porch hugging my encyclopedias to my chest, trying to ignore the sting of comparison. That was when I began to realize gifts in our family were not just objects, they were messages. Mine said you must work harder, be useful, and grow up. He said you are adored, you deserve joy simply for existing. As I grew older, the pattern deepened. By the time I was 10, I was no longer simply a child but the designated helper. I washed dishes every night, vacuumed every Saturday, folded clothes until my fingers ached, and when my parents came home late, I even prepared simple dinners. Nathan left toys, crumbs, and dirty socks everywhere, and when I complained, my mother would sigh and say, "He's just a boy, you're the older one, be patient." One afternoon, he spilled juice all over the carpet, and when my father saw the mess, he looked at me, not him, and ordered Eleanor, "Go get a towel." I protested that it wasn't me, but he only repeated that I was the responsible one. That was the rule of my life. Responsibility belonged to me whether or not the fault was mine. At school, I excelled, earning straight A's, winning spelling bees, collecting certificates, but when I brought them home, my father only nodded and said, "Good, that's expected." Nathan once brought home a flimsy participation ribbon from a kindergarten race, and they hugged him, clapped, took pictures, and phoned relatives to brag about his talent. I learned that excellence from me was invisible, while mediocrity from him was cause for celebration. Christmas, when I was 12, made the lesson permanent. I had been asking for a laptop to do my school assignments. I researched affordable options, wrote down the prices, and explained like a miniature lawyer why it was necessary. On Christmas morning, I unwrapped a battered second-hand laptop that barely turned on. My father told me, "This will teach you to be resourceful." An hour later, Nathan unwrapped the latest gaming console with a stack of brand new games, and my father clapped him on the back saying this will help his hand-eye coordination. I sat there with my broken laptop on my lap and a forced smile on my face, while inside a cold, quiet anger settled, the kind of anger that doesn't scream, but instead grows roots. By 14, I was the family babysitter. Every Friday, my parents went out for dinner, and I was left in charge of Nathan without pay, without gratitude, just expectation. "You're so mature for your age," my mother would tell me, and I believed it was praise, not realizing it was a convenient excuse to keep talking to me. At 15, I started working at the local grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries, not for luxuries, but for basic things like clothes and notebooks. Nathan never worked a day in his teenage years. He was handed an allowance every week simply because boys need encouragement, my father explained. When I asked why I had to work for what he was given for free, my father patted my shoulder and said it builds character. My character was being built on exhaustion, while Nathan's was built on indulgence. Family gatherings only deepened the divide. Relatives would come, and my parents would beam as they spoke of Nathan's soccer games or his latest drawing, while my honor roll achievements were brushed aside with, "Of course you did, Eleanor, you're the responsible one." Those words, responsible, mature, strong, became chains disguised as compliments. They excused every sacrifice demanded from me and every unfairness that followed. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, asking questions a child should never have to ask. Why am I not enough? Why is his smallest achievement celebrated while mine vanishes into silence? Why do they love him so easily and only respect me conditionally? I never received an answer, only silence. But within that silence, I began to form a promise. If no one else saw me, I would make myself impossible to ignore. I would work so hard, achieve so much, build a life so undeniable that even my parents would have no choice but to acknowledge me. I did not know then that this promise would one day lead me into the fire, that it would shape my path to both success and betrayal. All I knew was that I refused to remain invisible forever. When people talk about their teenage years, they often remember freedom, first loves, parties, and the thrill of discovering who they were meant to be. For me, those years were not about discovery or freedom, but about carrying burdens that were never mine and pretending that exhaustion was maturity. By the time I turned 13, the pattern at home was carved in stone. Nathan was the golden child, adored and indulged, while I was the one expected to keep everything together. I remember walking home from school carrying a heavy backpack full of textbooks while Nathan, 5 years younger, strolled behind me licking ice cream my mother had bought him. When we reached the house, she told me to do the dishes before starting my homework, and when I pointed out that Nathan had dropped crumbs all over the floor, she sighed and said, "Eleanor, you're the older one, you know better, clean it up for him." At 14, my responsibilities multiplied. Every weekend, my parents would dress up and leave the house for dinners with friends or church gatherings. They would glance at me and say, "Eleanor, watch your brother," and that was it. No questions about whether I had homework or wanted to go out with friends, no thought about whether I was tired. Nathan threw tantrums if I told him to go to bed, and when he hit me once for turning off the television, my parents laughed and said boys will be boys. I sat on the couch with tears in my eyes, realizing that even when he hurt me, I would be the one blamed if I complained. At school, I tried to escape into achievement. I joined the debate club, science fairs, and every academic competition available. I thought maybe if I brought home enough trophies, they would look at me the way they looked at him when he scored a single goal in a soccer match. But their reaction never changed. When I won first place in a statewide essay competition, my father nodded and said, as expected, "You always do well." That same month, Nathan received a certificate just for participating in a summer soccer camp, and they threw him a little party in the backyard with balloons and cake. I remember standing there watching him blow out candles while holding my essay certificate in my hand, invisible. At 15, I decided I could no longer depend on them for even the smallest needs. I applied for a job at the local grocery store. I worked evenings and weekends, bagging groceries and stocking shelves while my classmates went to football games or parties. The first time I held my paycheck, I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. It was proof that I could take care of myself, but also proof that my parents never intended to. When I used the money to buy new shoes for school, my mother said you shouldn't waste money on things like that, and the next week she bought Nathan brand name sneakers that cost twice as much. I lived in constant comparison. If I studied late into the night, they told me I was too serious, that I should loosen up, but when Nathan stayed up playing video games, they called him creative and intelligent. If I chose to work extra shifts, they accused me of neglecting family time, but when Nathan skipped family dinners to hang out with friends, they said boys need freedom. Every choice I made was judged harshly, while his choices were softened and excused. By 16, I had grown used to exhaustion. I would wake at 6, attend classes until 3, go to my job until 10, then return home to finish assignments until 2 in the morning. My eyes burned constantly and my body ached, but I never complained. I couldn't afford to. When I once mentioned being tired, my father smirked and said hard work builds character. Meanwhile, Nathan slept in until noon on weekends, spent his allowance on gadgets, and never once lifted a finger in the house. The loneliness of those years was unbearable. Friends invited me to parties, but I always had shifts to cover. Teachers praised me, but the recognition never followed me home. At night, I lay awake listening to the sound of Nathan's laughter drifting through the walls as he played games online while I studied by lamplight. I wondered what it would feel like to be carefree, to have someone cheer for me simply because I existed. Instead, I learned that my value in the family was measured only by how much I could endure without breaking. There was one evening that sealed the truth for me. I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks, preparing for finals. Nathan had just thrown his backpack on the floor and announced that he failed a math test. My mother rushed to his side, hugging him, saying, "Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll find you a tutor." My father added, "We'll make sure you get the support you need. You're smart, you just need encouragement." I sat there with my hands clenched, because 2 weeks earlier when I brought home a B+ in chemistry, after working double shifts, my father had frowned and said, "You should have tried harder." In that moment, I realized that no matter what I achieved, I would never be celebrated the way he was comforted in failure. Those teenage years did not break me, though they tried. They built in me a fire, a hunger to prove that I was more than the role they had written for me. Every time they ignored my achievements, I promised myself I would reach higher. Every time they dismissed my struggles, I vowed I would build a life where no one could reduce me to silence. I did not yet know what betrayals awaited me, but I knew this. If love was conditional in my family, then I would learn to live without it. When I was accepted into university, I thought perhaps things would finally change. I had worked harder than anyone in my school, juggled classes, long shifts at the grocery store, sleepless nights, and relentless pressure. When the acceptance letter arrived with a partial scholarship covering part of the tuition, I held it in my hands, trembling with hope. I imagined my parents might finally look at me with pride, that maybe they would say, "We're so proud of you, Eleanor. We'll help you with the rest. We'll support your dreams." But when I showed them the letter, their expressions were unreadable. My father adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said, "We need to talk about finances." I sat in his office that evening, the smell of paper and ink around us, and listened as he explained that they could not contribute a cent to my education. My mother nodded solemnly and added that we have to save for Nathan's future. His programs will be expensive, his opportunities need to be protected. Nathan was still 3 years away from college, yet his imaginary tuition already mattered more than my real one. I nodded quietly, pretending to take it like an adult, pretending it didn't crush me. I asked about student loans, about grants, about options, while inside my heart sank. That night, I stayed awake in my room staring at the ceiling, realizing I would have to carry this weight alone too. The next day, I revised my budget, applied for every scholarship I could find, and looked for jobs near campus. When September came, I left home with 2 suitcases, a second-hand laptop that barely worked, and a heart full of determination. College was supposed to be the best years of life, but for me it was survival. My scholarship covered less than half the tuition, so I took 2 part-time jobs. During the week, I worked at the university library, shelving books, checking out materials, trying to study during quiet shifts. On weekends, I worked at a cafe, serving coffee with a smile while my legs ached. I averaged 5 hours of sleep a night. My diet was instant noodles and cheap sandwiches, and my immune system collapsed every winter with constant colds. But I never missed class, never turned in an assignment late, and never once asked my parents for money. When they called, the conversations were always about Nathan. He had made the varsity soccer team, he needed a new computer for school projects, he had been selected for a summer camp that cost thousands. They spoke of him with excitement while my own achievements were ignored. Once my mother casually mentioned that they had bought Nathan a brand new laptop, a top model, because he needed it for his classes. I thought of my old machine held together with tape and said nothing. By my sophomore year, I chose to study law. Something about it called to me. The structure, the clarity, the promise that fairness could exist somewhere even if it never existed in my own home. I threw myself into classes, debates, and internships. Professors began to notice me, recommending me for opportunities, encouraging me to aim high. The more I achieved, the more determined I became to prove that I was not just the forgotten daughter, not just the responsible one, but someone who could stand on her own in the world. But even in those years, the shadow of betrayal lingered. One summer, after my second year, I returned home for a week. I thought maybe distance had softened my parents. At dinner one evening, my father brought up Nathan's future again. He was struggling with grades, he might not get into the programs they wanted, and they looked at me with expectation. "Your brother needs your support, Eleanor," my mother said, as if I had money to spare. I sat there exhausted from months of double shifts and endless exams, listening to them describe how I, a 19-year-old barely paying my own bills, should help fund Nathan's tutoring. I excused myself from the table and cried quietly in my old bedroom, realizing once again that my sacrifices would never end in their eyes. Still, I endured. By my final year, I had secured an internship at a respected law firm. It paid enough for me to afford a tiny sublet in the city, and for the first time, I tasted financial independence. I loved the long hours, the complexity of cases, and the sharpness of the courtroom. I felt alive in ways I never had at home. And when they offered me a full-time position after graduation, I accepted with tears in my eyes because it meant freedom. When I called my parents to share the news, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately followed with, "Nathan has been accepted to a summer technology program. We're so proud." In that moment, the last fragile hope that they might ever celebrate me died. I understood finally that no matter what I achieved, their admiration was reserved for him. Graduation came. I stood on the stage in my black gown, degree in hand, the result of years of sacrifice. As I looked into the audience, I saw them sitting there, clapping politely, but their eyes were fixed on Nathan, nudging him to pay attention. Even in my moment of triumph, I was a shadow in their story. And that was the first real betrayal, the moment I knew I could not count on their love or recognition. I would have to build a life without it, and I promised myself that I would. When I finally graduated and stepped into the world of adulthood, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. I was only 22, but I had already lived a lifetime of responsibility and sacrifice. I moved to the city with a small suitcase, a stack of law books, and the offer letter from a firm that had seen my potential during my internship. The apartment I found was nothing glamorous, a tiny studio with thin walls and a view of a brick alley, but to me, it was a palace because it was mine. For the first time in my life, I closed a door behind me and knew that everything inside belonged to me, that no one could order me to clean up after them or dismiss my needs as less important. I bought groceries without having to beg, decorated the walls with second-hand art, and placed my worn laptop on a desk that I had built myself from cheap parts, feeling like a queen in a kingdom carved out of hard work. At the firm, I was determined to prove myself. I volunteered for long hours, took cases that others avoided, and studied tirelessly. My colleagues sometimes rolled their eyes at my intensity, but I had something they didn't: the fire of someone who had spent her entire life overlooked. Every compliment from a senior partner felt like water in the desert. Every successful case was a reminder that I could no longer be ignored. Within a year, I was given more responsibilities, and with them came better pay. I remember the day I paid off my first student loan installment ahead of schedule. I sat on my bed with the receipt in my hand, tears in my eyes, whispering to myself, "You did this alone." While my career grew, my connection with my family shrank. I called them on birthdays and holidays out of obligation, but the conversations always circled back to Nathan. He had changed majors, he needed money for new courses, he was considering different career paths. My parents sighed about how hard things were for him and spoke as if I, their daughter who was thriving in one of the toughest fields, was a mere afterthought. Once when I mentioned a promotion, they responded with silence, then immediately began discussing Nathan's recreational soccer league. That was when I stopped sharing my victories. They didn't deserve to hear them. By 26, I had climbed higher than I ever thought possible. My loans were almost gone, my savings accounts were growing, and I had begun looking at real estate. I will never forget the day I signed the papers for my first condominium. It was small, a one-bedroom on the edge of the city, but it had hardwood floors and a window that caught the morning light. I stood there with the keys in my hand, running my fingers along the smooth wall, whispering, "This is mine." Every late-night shift, every tear, every ignored achievement had led to this. I should have been happy, and in many ways I was, but there was an emptiness too. I had everything I had once dreamed of: independence, security, the beginnings of success. Yet a part of me still longed for something as simple as a phone call from my parents saying, "We are proud of you." That call never came. Instead, they phoned me one evening to ask if I could contribute to Nathan's graduate program. I laughed bitterly, not out loud but inside, realizing that even when I bought a home by myself, even when I became a lawyer respected in my firm, to them I was still just a resource for Nathan's dreams. So I built a chosen family instead. Friends from work, people who respected me for who I was, became the brothers and sisters I never had. We celebrated each other's victories, shared meals, and built the kind of support system I had always craved. Slowly, I learned that family did not always mean blood. Sometimes it meant the people who saw you truly saw you without conditions. As the years passed, my life stabilized. I had routines, I had comfort, I had purpose. But under the surface, there remained a wound, one that never fully healed. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had risen above, but deep down I still carried the child who had been invisible for so long. And that is why, when I received the call to return home for my mother's birthday, I agreed. Part of me thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe after all I had built, they would finally look at me with pride. I did not know then that I was walking straight into the moment when their betrayal would become undeniable. The moment when everything I had endured would sharpen into the cruelest test of all. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday evening while I was still at the office, surrounded by stacks of case files and the hum of fluorescent lights. My phone buzzed, and when I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, I hesitated. We had not spoken in months, and even when we did, the conversations were brief and hollow, filled with updates about Nathan rather than any real concern for me. I answered anyway, pressing the phone to my ear, my voice cautious as I said hello. Her tone was unusually warm as she told me that she was planning a grand celebration for her 60th birthday, and that it would mean the world to her if I came home. She said the family would all be there, relatives I had not seen in years, and she wanted her children by her side. For a moment my heart tightened, because beneath the practiced indifference I had built, there was still a little girl inside me who longed to be wanted, even if only for a day. I heard myself agreeing before my mind could remind me of all the times I had been invisible in that house. That night I lay awake in my city apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering what awaited me if I returned. Part of me dreaded the inevitable comparisons, the conversations that would orbit around Nathan like planets around the sun. But another part of me, the part that still carried unhealed wounds, whispered maybe this time will be different. Maybe they will see what I have become. Maybe they will finally say the words I have been waiting for my entire life. I imagined walking through the front door, my mother hugging me tightly, my father telling relatives proudly that his daughter was a lawyer, independent, successful. The fantasy was fragile, but it was enough to push me into booking the ticket. When the train pulled into my hometown station days later, I stepped onto the platform with a suitcase in hand and a storm in my chest. The air smelled the same, a mixture of freshly cut grass and gasoline, and the streets had not changed, lined with tidy houses and mailboxes painted with cheerful colors. Yet as I walked toward the place I once called home, I felt a weight pressing down on me, memories flooding back of encyclopedias given as birthday gifts, of laughter that never included me, of endless chores and cold silences. Still, I told myself I was no longer that girl. I was Eleanor, attorney at law, a woman who had built herself from nothing. Surely they would see that. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint on the shutters peeling, the lawn less perfectly trimmed. My father opened the door when I rang the bell, his hair grayer, his shoulders stooped, but his expression unchanged, the same measured look that had once reduced every triumph of mine to something expected. He greeted me politely, as though I were a distant acquaintance rather than his daughter who had traveled hours to be there. My mother bustled out behind him, fussing with my coat, telling me how wonderful it was that I came, her words quick and light but her eyes already drifting past me as if waiting for Nathan to appear. Inside, the house smelled of roast chicken and old wood, and the living room was crowded with relatives. They clapped when they saw me, offering hugs and polite words, but almost immediately the conversation shifted to Nathan. He had just started a new program, he was considering buying a car, he was full of plans. My achievements, my career, my independence were left unspoken, dangling in the air like forgotten decorations. I smiled, nodding, answering questions politely, but inside I felt the familiar ache of invisibility. That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the faded posters still on the wall, I realized that nothing had changed. I had built an entire life away from this place, had bled and fought and survived, yet within these walls I was still the shadow, still the responsible one who did not need praise, still the daughter whose worth was measured only by what she could endure. And though I did not know it yet, this return home was not about celebration. It was the beginning of a demand that would test every boundary I had built, a demand that would ignite the revenge I had carried silently for years. The birthday celebration unfolded exactly as I had expected, with long tables filled with food, relatives laughing loudly, and every conversation eventually circling back to Nathan. My mother beamed as she recounted his latest pursuits. My father's eyes lit up with every mention of his plans, and I sat among them smiling politely while sipping my wine, invisible yet again. But as the evening grew late and the guests began to leave, I noticed hushed voices carrying from the kitchen. I had gone upstairs to fetch my bag when I paused at the top of the stairs, hearing my father's low tone mixed with Nathan's. Curiosity pulled me down silently, careful with each step, until I stopped just out of sight. What I heard next sent a chill through my entire body. Nathan's voice trembled as he confessed that he had accumulated debts from gambling, debts that were far beyond what he could pay. He spoke of $50, maybe $60,000 owed, of threats from people who would not wait much longer. My father's reply came slow and heavy, laced with worry but not with reproach. He told Nathan not to panic, that they would figure it out, that family always protects its own. And then his voice hardened in a way that made my breath catch. Eleanor has money now, she can help. Nathan hesitated, muttering that I might refuse, but my father dismissed the idea as though it were impossible. He said she owes it to this family, after all we invested in her, after all the sacrifices we made. My mother's voice joined them, soft but resolute, saying she will pay. She has always been the responsible one. She knows what must be done. My hands tightened on the railing until my knuckles turned white, rage surging inside me so violently I thought I might scream. After everything I had endured, after the years of neglect, after funding my entire education alone, they now plotted to make me shoulder Nathan's reckless mistakes. They were planning not to ask but to tell, to corner me into paying off his debts as though my success existed only to serve him. I slipped back into my room silently, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. I sat on the edge of the bed staring into the dark, every memory of my childhood crashing down on me, the encyclopedias, the chores, the invisible triumphs, the endless comparisons. All of it had led to this moment, this proof that in their eyes I was not a daughter with her own life but a resource, a bank account with a name. For hours I lay awake, replaying their words, feeling fury twist into clarity. This was the night I understood there would be no redemption, no final moment of pride or recognition. They had chosen Nathan again and again, and now they expected me to clean up the ruins he created. By dawn, my decision was made. I would not give them a cent. I would not let them strip from me the life I had built with my own blood and tears. If they wanted war, I was ready, because for the first time in my life, I finally held the power. The morning after that sleepless night, I walked into the kitchen where my parents and Nathan were already seated, the air heavy with unspoken tension. My mother poured coffee with forced cheerfulness, my father cleared his throat as if preparing for a speech, and Nathan avoided my eyes, his shoulders slumped in shame, yet still cushioned by the certainty that they would protect him. I sat down calmly, my face unreadable, and waited. My father began with words that sounded rehearsed, about family unity, about the importance of standing together in difficult times, and then he arrived at the heart of it. Nathan had made mistakes, but he needed help, and since I was doing so well, it was only right that I contribute. My mother nodded and added that they had already given me so much growing up that now it was my turn to give back. Nathan muttered something about being sorry, but it rang hollow, like an apology given only because it was expected. I listened in silence, my hands folded neatly on the table, letting their words wash over me. Inside, I felt no panic, no doubt, only a strange clarity as cold as ice. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally stand up to them, to cut through their expectations like a blade, and now the moment was here. When my father finally finished, I lifted my eyes and said quietly but firmly, "I will not pay a single cent for Nathan's mistakes." The room went still. My mother blinked rapidly as if she had misheard, my father's face darkened, and Nathan looked up in shock. I repeated it slowly, each word deliberate. "I will not give him my money, I worked for it, I sacrificed for it, and I will not throw it away because he couldn't control himself." Their reaction was immediate. My father slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising as he accused me of being ungrateful, reminding me of every meal, every roof, every so-called sacrifice they had made for me. My mother's voice trembled with disappointment as she said, "How could you turn your back on your own brother? How could you be so cold?" Nathan, emboldened by their anger, shouted that I had always thought I was better than him, that money had made me arrogant. I sat there, strangely calm, watching the storm unfold around me. For the first time in my life, their words did not pierce me. For the first time, I saw clearly that their love had always been conditional, their pride always reserved for him, and that nothing I ever did would change that truth. When the shouting died down, I stood slowly, pushing my chair back, and said in a voice that shook with quiet power, "I owe you nothing." I walked out of that kitchen, out of that house, and though my hands trembled, my steps were steady. I knew that by refusing them, I had drawn a line that could never be erased, but instead of fear, I felt freedom. They had demanded that I sacrifice everything I had built, and I had finally said no. That was the day Eleanor, the invisible daughter, ceased to exist. That was the day I became someone else entirely, someone who would no longer bend, someone who was ready to fight. I left the house that morning with my suitcase in hand and the cold air burning my lungs, but my steps were steady, fueled by a resolve I had never felt before. I checked into a small hotel near the station and spent the day making calls, not to family, but to my bank, my firm, and a trusted colleague. I explained the situation carefully, and within hours I had taken precautions, freezing accounts that could be targeted, changing passwords, securing documents, and ensuring that no one could access my financial life without me knowing. It was not paranoia, it was preparation, because I understood that my parents and Nathan would not simply accept my refusal, they would try to pressure me, guilt me, maybe even deceive me into surrendering what I had built. That evening, as I sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, my phone lit up with call after call from home, and finally I answered. The moment my mother's voice came through the line, it was dripping with urgency, her tone shifting between pleading and scolding. She said, "We raised you, we gave you everything, how can you abandon us now?" My father took the phone next, his voice hard, accusing me of selfishness, of betrayal, of forgetting where I came from. And then Nathan, his words slurred with desperation, shouting that his life was on the line, that I had the power to save him. I listened without interrupting, letting their words spill into the room like poison I had finally grown immune to. When the silence came, I spoke slowly, my voice firm as steel, telling them that I knew everything, that I had heard their plan the night before, that I was not blind to their intentions. I told them I had already secured my finances, that any attempt to manipulate me would fail, and that if they tried to forge documents or use my name for their schemes, I would not hesitate to press charges. The silence that followed was sharper than their shouting had ever been. My father exploded, calling me ungrateful, cold, heartless, accusing me of destroying the family. My mother wept, her sobs breaking through the line, begging me to reconsider, insisting that blood should mean loyalty. Nathan cursed me, blaming me for his ruin as if his choices were mine to carry. But none of it moved me anymore. For the first time, their words had no power. I let them rage, I let them beg, and then I told them in a voice I barely recognized as my own that I was done. I said I had carried their neglect for a lifetime, I had worked for every scrap they denied me, and now I would not give away what I had built to cover Nathan's failures. I told them if they ever tried to contact me again for money, I would consider it harassment and take legal action. There was a pause, a heavy, suffocating pause, and then my father's voice came cold and final. "You are no longer our daughter." I felt the sting of the words, but behind it there was something else, something almost like relief. For years I had begged silently to be seen, to be loved, to be enough. Now the truth was laid bare. Their love had always been an illusion tied to what they could take from me. By disowning me, they had freed me too. I ended the call, placed the phone on the nightstand, and sat in the quiet of the hotel room with tears streaming down my face, not tears of regret, but of release. It was the end of something toxic, and the beginning of something I had yet to define. That night I slept deeply for the first time in years, knowing that I had faced them, that I had drawn a line no one could cross. The war they had begun was over, not because I had lost, but because I had finally refused to fight on their terms. When I returned to the city, I felt like someone who had walked through fire and survived, scarred but unbroken. The confrontation with my family had burned away the last traces of illusion I had clung to, the fragile hope that one day they might see me, accept me, love me without conditions. For the first time in my life, I no longer carried that weight. I was free, and freedom, though lonely, was intoxicating. I threw myself into work with a new kind of focus, sharper than before, no longer fueled by a desperate need to prove myself to them, but by the pure desire to build a life on my own terms. My cases grew larger, my reputation stronger, and my savings healthier. Each small victory felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a fortress they could never touch. But success was not only about money or career. It was about creating a life that finally felt like mine. I decorated my home with colors I loved, filled my kitchen with foods I had once denied myself, and hosted dinners for friends who became family. In those gatherings, with laughter spilling through the rooms and glasses clinking in toasts, I felt a warmth I had never known at my parents' table. These were people who saw me, who celebrated me not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. With them, I learned what love without condition looked like, and with them, I began to heal. There were nights when the old pain returned, when memories of my childhood would creep back in whispers. I would remember standing on the porch holding encyclopedias while Nathan rode his electric car, or sitting alone at the kitchen table while my parents praised his smallest achievements. The sting of those moments never fully disappeared, but instead of breaking me, they became reminders of how far I had come. I would sit with a glass of wine by the window, staring at the city lights, and whisper to myself that I had built this life, that no one could take it away, that the little girl who was invisible had finally become impossible to ignore. In time, I began to mentor younger women at the firm, interns and new associates who reminded me of myself in those early years. I told them to never let anyone define their worth, to fight for their independence, to remember that resilience was forged in the fires of neglect and doubt. Each time I spoke those words, I felt as if I was speaking to the younger version of me too, comforting her in ways my parents never did. And slowly, the wound inside me began to close. One evening, months after the confrontation, I received an email from Nathan. His tone was desperate, filled with apologies and pleas, claiming he had changed, that he needed just one last chance. I stared at the screen for a long time, my chest tightening with a familiar ache, but then I closed the email without replying. It was not anger that drove me but clarity. I had already given them more chances than they deserved, and now I owed them nothing. Silence was my final answer, and in that silence I felt stronger than ever. Life was not perfect, but it was mine. Every morning when I walked into my office, every evening when I returned to my home, every smile shared with friends reminded me that I had rebuilt myself from ashes. I was no longer just surviving. I was living, fully and fiercely. And though my family's betrayal had shaped me, it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the choice I had made to rise, to fight, to claim a life that belonged only to me. Months turned into years, and the distance I had created from my family became the air I breathed, clean and necessary. I rarely thought of them except in fleeting moments when memories rose unbidden, but then one afternoon an envelope arrived at my office with handwriting I recognized instantly. It was from Nathan. I almost threw it away, yet something compelled me to open it. The letter inside was long, filled with apologies, confessions of failure, and desperate pleas. He wrote that his debts had consumed him, that he had lost almost everything, that he was no longer the golden boy my parents had once adored. He begged me for help, not just financial but emotional, claiming that he finally understood how much he had relied on the family's favoritism, how much damage it had done to me. As I read his words, I felt a storm of emotions, anger twisting with pity, grief tangled with a satisfaction I could not deny. For so long I had been invisible, the shadow to his brilliance, the resource to his needs. And now here he was, broken, acknowledging truths he had once denied. That night, I sat by the window with the letter in my lap, staring at the city lights. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to shred the paper and let silence speak for me as it had before. But another part of me, the part that had longed for recognition, leaned into his words. It was not forgiveness I felt, but a kind of victory, the knowledge that the truth had finally surfaced, that even he could no longer deny it. My revenge was not in destroying him, but in living so fully that his collapse only highlighted the strength I had built. I realized then that revenge is not always about retribution. Sometimes it is about thriving in spite of those who tried to hold you down. I wrote him a reply, not long, not cruel, but clear. I told him that I was glad he had recognized the truth, that his words mattered more than he realized, but that I could not and would not rescue him. I told him that I hoped he would find a way to rebuild his life as I had rebuilt mine, but that my role in his story was finished. I signed it simply, Eleanor, and sealed the envelope with a calm I had never known before. When I dropped the letter into the mailbox, I felt lighter, as if I had set down the last piece of a burden I had carried for decades. My family had tried to consume me, to use me as a crutch, to erase me with neglect, but in the end I had walked away and built something they could never take. That was my revenge, my quiet and relentless triumph. I did not need them to suffer for me to win. I only needed to live beyond their reach, to prove that their cruelty had failed to define me. And so I chose peace, not because they deserved it, but because I did. I chose to keep my distance, to protect the life I had created, to honor the little girl who had once been invisible by ensuring that the woman she became was impossible to ignore. This was the ending I gave myself, the ending no one could write for me. I was Eleanor, and I was free. Years have passed since I walked away from the house where I once lived as a shadow. The lines on my face are deeper now, etched by both sorrow and triumph, but when I look in the mirror, I see someone whole. My name carries weight in the legal world, my home is filled with warmth and laughter, and I no longer wake in the night with the ache of invisibility pressing on my chest. Yet sometimes, when the city grows quiet and I hear the hum of life beyond my window, I think of that young girl holding encyclopedias while her brother rode an electric car, of the teenager wiping away tears at the kitchen table while her parents praised his smallest steps. I think of her and I smile, because I carried her with me through every storm, and together we made it here. I never reconciled with my family. After that last exchange with Nathan, there were no more letters, no more phone calls, no more attempts to pull me back into the cycle of sacrifice. Perhaps they learned at last that I could not be bent, or perhaps they simply found someone else to bear their weight. Either way, their silence is a gift. In its place, I have written a new story with friends who became family, with colleagues who became allies, with students and young women I mentor who remind me daily that resilience can be inherited not by blood, but by spirit. People sometimes ask me if I regret it, if I regret severing ties so completely, if I regret refusing to save Nathan when I had the means to do so. My answer is always the same. Regret is a luxury of those who were loved enough to be torn by choice. I was never given that kind of love. What I was given was neglect, comparison, and demands. Out of that, I built strength. Out of that, I built freedom. My revenge was never about making them suffer. It was about refusing to let them define me. I did not destroy them, I simply outgrew them, and sometimes that is the sweetest vengeance of all. Now, when I walk into a courtroom, when I sit across from a client who feels powerless, I remember the girl I once was. I remember her silence, her loneliness, and I speak for her and for all those like her. And when I return home at night, unlocking the door to a place filled with light and love, I whisper to her softly, "We did it. We survived, we endured, and we rose. No one can take that away. I am Eleanor. I was once invisible. Now I am unstoppable."